Hello everybody, welcome to the digital pre-recorded lecture for the asynchronous class. We're working our way through the mushroom at the end of the world, thinking about life in the ruins of capitalism. So the first chapter from today's readings, What Happened to the State? One of the things that Singh noticed doing her research is this contrast between Japanese American and Southeastern Asian American pickers. And this contrast is according to Singh, provides us with insight into the history of shifts in labor and global practices that she's going to get into in the next few chapters. But what she noticed is this difference where Japanese Americans, she describes it as Japanese, quote-unquote, Japanese practices being kept in the private sphere, or practices that are culturally associated with quote-unquote Japaneseness, are only flourishing as an American-style hobby. Basically, you can be Japanese, but it needs to be in the private sphere, and it needs to be circumscribed as part of as a smaller part of the encompassing American identity. And in Singh's family, this took the form of things like learning to cook hamburgers and pizza in a moment when her family was being watched by the FBI in case they were, I don't know, like insurgents or something. And so the idea here, right, both in her family, let me go back. Singh's family is Chinese, not Japanese. But what she notices is the similarity between these cultural practices within the Japanese camp and her own family's understandings of what it means to be Chinese American. And so within the Japanese camp, you can be proud to be of Japanese heritage. However, that pride must be expressed in self-consciously American ways. That's a quote from page 100. So, for example, most of the Japanese pickers went to Buddhist churches. They were Buddhists, but they went to these places that were essentially Buddhist churches, and then the people called them Buddhist churches. And the idea here is that these are actually run like Protestant churches with pews and prayer books and everything. And there's a white I'm blanking on the word. There's a white person leading there's a white spiritual leader, which is seen as another kind of badge of American identity within this context of Buddhist practice. Now, this is very different than the way identity is expressed in Southeastern Asian camps, where there's this emphasis on recuperating village life from these places in rural Southeast Asia. There's practices of maintaining differences that mattered back in Southeastern Asia, whether you sit on stools versus sitting on the floor, whether you eat raw vegetables versus preparing soups and sautés with chopsticks. All of these things reflects on various ethnic identities and differences. And people talk about them in a very self-conscious way as a symbol of being mine or Laos. And even within these camps, Christianity has an indigenous Southeastern twist, where many of the people in these camps are Christians, but they talk about Christianity very differently than white Protestants, where breaking from these kinds of narratives of being lost and found by God, immigrants in these camps are more likely to say things like, my family was dispersed by war, but God brought us back together. In which there's this kind of parallel between indigenous Southeastern approaches to spirits in a non-Christian frame that gets translated into these kinds of Christian theologies. So even Christianity has this Southeastern Asian twist. And so how do we make sense of this difference? As Singh says, it's not a difference of culture per se. It's not a difference of, I forget the other thing that it is, and instead it's a difference in history. It's a difference in the history of immigration. And as she writes on page 101, Between the arrival of Japanese Americans and the coming of Lao and Cambodian Americans, something important changed in the relationship of the state and its citizens. This is a shift in how American citizenship and identity gets constructed, as well as a shift away from policies of assimilation that are combined with the dismantling of the welfare state. So Japanese Americans, like Tsing's own Chinese American family, were subjected to coercive assimilation within a welfare state. This includes Japanese incarceration during World War I, but also institutions like schools and affirmative action that were basically means of integrating immigrants into a blanched American identity. This kind of melting pot ideology, really forcibly assimilating their children. But this shift in the 1980s, by the time Southeast Asian immigrants are arriving, and in the 1980s, this welfare state is being dismantled. So there aren't these kinds of resources that are available. And instead, immigrants are left to fend on their own. So instead, they rely on skills cultivated in war, and end up doing things like mushroom picking. Now, Japanese mushroom pickers are different in that most of them are not doing it for commercial purposes. They're doing it as a ritual of Japanese identity. Whereas Southeastern Asian Americans have different rituals that were developed by American authorities in refugee camps. And part of this ritual of becoming an American citizen that takes place within the refugee camp is this process of interviewing, this bureaucratic ritual of interviewing. And through the interview, potential immigrants are expected to proclaim both anti-communist sentiment and a commitment to freedom. And that's a prerequisite for becoming citizens of the United States. So as a result, there are these very different expectations about what it means to be American and how one expresses that identity, how one expresses relationships to various parts of Asia. That has to do with this shift away from the welfare state, the dismantling of the welfare state, and a shift to a kind of neoliberal multiculturalist world, where there's space for diversity to some extent, but there sure ain't resources to help you out. And in this quote, Tsing points out that she's a little cynical of this, right? On the one hand, multiculturalism seems like a good thing, but how has multiculturalism been tied to the dismantling of the welfare state? And how does that help produce labor forces that are positioned to be exploited in these kinds of new emerging precarious systems by the global supply system? And so she writes at the end of the chapter, and what better participants in global supply chains? Here are nodes of ready and willing entrepreneurs with and without capital, able to mobilize their ethnic and religious fellows to fill almost any kind of economic niche. Wages and benefits are not needed. Whole communities can be mobilized, and for communal reasons. Universal standards of welfare hardly seem relevant. These are projects of freedom. Capitalists looking for salvage accumulation take no. So she's being a little sardonic, right? In this kind of ironic mode, saying like, oh look, through this kind of shift away from the welfare state, but also away from this kind of model of forced assimilation, this production of a homogenous whitened American citizen, you see the production of entire peoples positioned to be exploited by supply chains as precarious labor. So capitalists looking for salvage accumulation take no. The next chapter is Between the Dollar and the Yen. In this chapter, Tsing outlines a history of the supply chain model. Writing this chapter makes the bold assertion that the view of a neglected commodity change, i.e. Matsuzaki mushroom picking, can illuminate the surprisingly abrupt and global change, this global economic transformation that happened in the middle and the end of the 20th century. And she writes that this history that she's outlining exists between two quote-unquote bookends. On the one hand, in the mid-19th century, the U.S. Navy demands opening Edo Bay to foreign trade. This sparks a revolutionary movement in Japan that shifts national policies and throws Japan into the global market. So in the next 150 years then, by the end of the 20th century, Japan has emerged as a dominant commercial power in the world. And in fact, Japan's power creates an economic crisis in the U.S. And this catalyzes a major transformation in the U.S. economy. Basically, the U.S. companies start adopting this Japanese-style supply chain model. And this is part of what Singh calls a 1980s shareholder revolution, or she sometimes calls it the reverse black shifts. This opposite transformation where Japan forces the United States to shift its economic models in a major way. And this is the emergence of the supply chain model. This is the model in which companies outsource various parts of their production in order to increase profit. And this is really the core logic of supply chains, right? It's about outsourcing risk, environmental cost, and human cost. Singh gives the example of Japanese wood harvests and the desire for Indonesian wood. And what Japanese companies figured out they could do is that they could outsource the production to other places. They could provide specifications for the woods and cuttings that they need, and let third parties or second parties, whatever the right word is, take care of that work. What this meant was that Japan could first of all outsource production to places where labor is cheap, where benefits and labor rights are all but non-existent. And it gave, as Agnes Scott says, for benefits for Japanese capital. It avoided political risks in terms of timber industry, cutting timber in Indonesia. It facilitates transnational mobility. This is one of the ones I really find really interesting, these last two. It facilitates Japanese trade standards while ignoring environmental consequences. Because Japanese companies were able to outsource the actual cutting of logs, the result is that they're no longer responsible for environmental destruction. They get to ignore environmental consequences. And the fourth piece, right, is that this shift towards outsourcing accommodates illegal logging via subcontracting. So Japanese companies contract with Indonesian companies to perform the logging. The Indonesian companies may subcontract with another company. Now, if those subcontracted companies are engaging in illegal activity, well, that's not the Japanese company's fault, right? That's not their risk. That's outside of their responsibility. So basically, these supply chains are a way of increasing profit by outsourcing risk, environmental costs, and human costs. Nike is a great example that Singh talks about. So I gave you some demonic Nike shoes, almost called them Nazi shoes. When I was a kid, in the left, there was a joke we would say to each other. If we saw someone wearing Nike shoes, we'd say, "Oh, is that red dye on your shoes, or is it the blood of the children who made them?" So, as Agnes Scott talks about with Nike, the company doesn't actually make shoes. They design and advertise things. And she even quotes a vice president from Nike who says, "We don't know the first thing about manufacturing. We're marketers and designers." So basically, Nike designs and markets shoes, and in order to actually produce the shoes, they outsource that to countries outside of the United States where there are less labor protections and labor is cheaper. And the shoes get made in sweatshops and get shipped to the United States. And as a result, Nike saves money. And they're not responsible, and they can claim plausible deniability of sweatshop conditions. We see the same thing with Nestle happening in the contemporary world, right? Where Nestle says, well, if you really want us to be responsible for our supply chains and ensure that no one in our supply chains is using slave labor, the chocolate's going to be more expensive. And so, they're arguing basically like you should let us continue outsourcing to companies that use slave labor because that's what keeps the chocolate cheap. This is the economic model, right? How do you outsource human costs? How do you outsource environmental costs? So, one of the ways you do that, and so the result of this shift towards the supply chain is the dismantling of industry in the United States. It's the erosion of factory union labor. It's the factory of high-waged union-based factory labor, right? And the shifting of production overseas, where there are less human rights protections. This creates economic collapse, both in the United States and this really exploitative neo-colonial system, right, where colonized countries are kept with it. Anyway, that's a whole other lecture that I don't have time for. We'll get into that another time if you want, though. It's basically the newest form of colonization. It's a way of creating these same kinds of colonial inequalities, but without military force, instead using economic power. The next chapter, From Gifts to Commodities and Back. This chapter talks about the distinction between commodity versus gift exchange. And it notes that Matsuotake mushroom picking and consumption is dependent on the shift of gifts into mushrooms as gifts to transforming them into commodities and then back into gifts. So what is this about commodity versus gift exchange? This is an anthropological framework that comes out of early anthropologists, early 1900s anthropology about gift exchange networks. And so the paradigmatic example that Singh talks about is the Kula ring. If you haven't heard about the Kula ring in other classes, it's basically an enormous gift exchange network in the Pacific. Where you have these objects that are made, and I have an example of a necklace here that's part of the Kula ring, that get exchanged from place to place to place to place through these systems of gifts. And certain objects travel through the ring in a clockwise direction, and other objects travel through a counterclockwise direction. It's a system. It's an elaborate system of gift exchange. And the idea is that when you give someone one of these gifts, of these prestige objects, what you're saying is, you matter to me, you're important, and I'm giving you this thing to demonstrate that. On the other hand, when you have these gifts in your possession for the brief time you have them, you're saying, other people value me, people from faraway places value me. They're giving me these things because they respect me. I'm an important person. I have these long-range connections. And so these gifts are really about making relationships with others. Commodities, however, are different. Commodities are about alienation. When you go to the store and you buy, a cracker, you're not building a relationship with the people who made the cracker. You're not really even building a relationship with the store. I mean, we can talk about postmodern forms of consumption and late capitalism another time. But anyway, the classical example, alienation, is actually about divorcing objects from their relations. It's so that they can be consumed as private property. You aren't supposed to have a connection to the child labor that makes your Nike shoes. You're not supposed to think about them. That's alienated labor. So when I talk about, in the previous class, about capitalism being a kind of mode of extracting life, that's alienation, right? You translate your life through the factory into creating objects that can be bought and sold. And your life ends up being separated out from you and turned into a commodity. Suddenly, your labor takes the form of a Nike shoe that's not yours, that someone else owns, that they buy and sell for a profit while you make shit wages and barely survive. That's alienation. Alienation is the severing of relations in order to transform labor into profit. So, here's an example one of my professors gave me for how do we understand alienation. Alienation, we can think of it like, okay, so I would imagine I'm holding up a piece of paper for you, and I say, can you see the cloud in this piece of paper? Now, when I do this, most students stumble and guess around for a few minutes, right? They guess things like, well, okay, is it a metaphor? Is there like a metaphorical cloud in the paper that I'm supposed to see? And I'm like, no, it's not a metaphor. There is a physical cloud in this piece of paper. And so they think about it more, and they're like, are you sure it's not a metaphor? And I'm like, I'm very sure it's not a metaphor. And after a few minutes of these back and forth with students offering possibilities and me saying, that's a really interesting interpretation, but that's not what I mean when I say there's a cloud in this piece of paper. I mean there is a physical cloud in this piece of paper, and that is not a metaphor. And finally, a student will raise their hand and, completely sure they're wrong at this point, tentatively suggest, is it because there was a rain cloud that fell, and the rain fell and was soaked up by the tree, and the tree was cut down to make the paper? And I say, yes, that is the rain cloud in the piece of paper. And then I say, okay, can you now see the sun in the piece of paper? And at that point, everyone gets it. And they're like, okay, yeah, the sun that beats down, and the tree uses the photosynthesis to make more tree to grow, and then that gets cut down to make the paper. And then I say, can you see the workers in this piece of paper? So alienation is the trick that makes it hard for us to see the rain, the sun, and the workers in that piece of paper. We treat the piece of paper like an object, like a thing like private property, an isolated fixed thing, rather than a process that unfolds in slow motion, or sets of relationships which include laborers. Now, these two frameworks are often treated as opposed. In reality, things are much more complex. It's not a neat binary. And Matsutake mushrooms are a great example of how this binary framework ends up actually being more complicated on the ground. Because the funny thing about Matsutake mushroom harvesting and selling is that even while companies are able to amass profit and accumulate wealth, these objects, these mushrooms, are both alienated commodities and gift exchange, or what Singh calls it in page 123. These mushrooms, as gifts, have relationship-making force. So, this happens on the consumption side, after importing, where mushroom folks, what's the word I'm looking for? Wholesalers will sometimes describe themselves as matchmakers. They often will have a specific client in mind when they buy. And so they basically connect people. They forge relationships so that people get mushrooms for ceremonies, such as weddings, or there's a story about this anxiety that there's a rift in this family, and some people are visiting those family members to try and heal that rift, and there's this anxiety, will they bring out the Matsutake? The idea being that Matsutake would be this symbol or a sign saying that this rift is being healed and they're ready to make peace with each other. Or will the Matsutake be withheld? So here we're looking at Matsutake as a gift in multiple ways, right? It's not meant to be consumed by yourself. It's meant to be given and shared. It's something you might look for a ceremony like a wedding. It's something you might give to people to show that you're trying to heal emotional rift with family members. You can buy them in high-end grocery stores in order to, but then you're supposed to give them as gifts. Now, and wholesalers often imagine themselves or describe themselves as matchmakers, cultivating these relationships with specific clients. They also give clients advice on mushrooms. What's the grade? Is it good? Right? And so the commodities aren't generic. In the same way, most commodities, like a Nike shoe, one Nike shoe is going to be interchangeable with every other Nike shoe, assuming they're both right feet or left feet, right? A Nestle chocolate bar is supposed to be interchangeable with every other chocolate bar. But Matsutake is different. And so wholesalers give these gifts, in Anna Singh's word, of advice, saying, helping people identify the grade and the quality and things like that. So we're not talking about a generic commodity. We're talking about something a bit more complex. Likewise, in pickers' camps, Matsutake are enrolled in these elaborate performances of freedom. And so how does this, right, it's, let me go back. On the one hand, pickers will use large mushrooms as trophies, right? There's pride wrapped up into this, right? I don't think you feel a lot of pride over the line of stitching that you made on the factory floor making a Nike shoe. Maybe you do, I don't know. But for pickers, there's a whole process of pride. There's a whole exchange of, there's a whole system in which through this exchange of Matsutake for money, what you're exchanging is not only wealth, but also freedom as a personal value. This is not quite commodity economics at this point. At the same time, as Anna Singh says, there's one set of relations that is never included in Matsutake gifts in Japan. There's one set of relations that wholesalers and purchasers are just not concerned with, and that's the relations of foraging and buying in other countries. So, here's the contradiction, right? Matsutake, on the one hand, is about relationship making. It's about gift exchange in that sense. At the same time, there are some relations that are never included, that don't seem to count. So how do Matsutake mushrooms get translated between gifts and commodities? How does certain relationships and not others get alienated out of the process? The answer, Singh says, is in the sorting process, in which bulkers will hire precarious labor to sort mushrooms, Matsutake mushrooms, into different grades. And as a result, what happens is these precarious contingent labor sorters have no knowledge or interest in how the mushrooms get there. They have no interest in the conditions of picking. And as a result, they're able to, quote-unquote, purify them into inventory. And so the mushrooms are no longer entangled in the exchange of freedom between pickers and buyers. And the mushrooms become commodities that are organized according to particular sizes and grades. And so as Anna Singh says, right, it's only a couple of hours between this process of sorting and shipping through the plane that Matsutake mushrooms become commodities and not gifts. And yet, in those few hours, we see the alienation of the conditions of production. We see the alienation of the elaborate life worlds between Matsutake mushrooms, forests in Oregon, and pickers, and complex communities of pickers and buyers, all of which get alienated out from the process. Singh gives a lovely illustration of the quote-unquote babies, the little mushrooms, that are technically too small to be legally picked. Buyers say that when they buyers sell these to the bulkers, saying that the pickers made them buy them as well, and they probably don't add that much weight to the shipment because it's not that they're small, and yet. And so basically through this process of sorting, these precarious laborers throw out all the babies. No, they're not literally babies, right? They're mushrooms. They're not babies. They're just little mushrooms, but they're called babies colloquially. And it's through this process of sorting and throwing away that Matsutake mushrooms are transformed from gifts into inventory. At this point, I want to throw out a couple of resources that if we were having an in-person class, I would just show you this video. But as we think about supply chain and the consumption of ethics, I've argued that one of the things supply chains do in order to create profit is they outsource human cost. They outsource environmental cost. So I have a video, First is Tragedy, Then is Farce, which is a lecture by Slavoj Žižek, in which he talks about this alternative process. Not only are corporations outsourcing environmental and human costs, but then they're also reintegrating environmental consumption. They're resourcing ethical consumption into their products in order to create extra value and more profit. So, for example, Starbucks. When you go buy a cup of Starbucks, you're not only buying a cup of coffee, you're buying your responsibility to buy. You're buying an ethical goodness for yourself as someone who buys coffee that is ethically sourced. So there's a way in which ethical goodness is prepackaged and sold to us through the very corporations that are creating these systems of ruins. I don't know if y'all remember the Red campaign. That's probably before y'all's time. But Bono from YouTube was a big force in this Red campaign, which was basically a movement to, it's a development movement, a charity movement, seeking to increase living, to better living conditions in Africa in some vague way. And so you have these companies that signed on to the Red campaign, and for every object you buy, every commodity you buy, this company will give some amount of that profit to this charity in order to support, to end world hunger or something like that. So, again, we see companies like Nike that start producing Red branded shoes within this campaign. So, they create poverty through this process of outsourcing and using sweatshops. And yet, you can also buy your own ethical consumption, your own ethical goodness with a pair of shoes because you know Nike will give a little bit of money to a charity. So Slavoj Žižek is critiquing this system. And I think that's a useful other side for thinking about these issues. Not only how are human costs outsourced within supply chains, but then also how do you account for this problem of quote-unquote ethical consumption, the ways in which ethics are then packaged and sold back to us. And so I have a funny meme for you. Ethical consumption. They used to say there's no ethical consumption in capitalism because all capitalism is based on exploitation. That's a phrase people used to say on the left. But this is kind of a joke on that, saying there is ethical consumption. You can eat the rich. The second thing is an article by my friend Jean Favini, and if you have time, read it as an optional thing. It's interesting, right? What he's talking about in this is in the same vein as the interlude that ends this section's readings. Jean is talking about, I don't know why I'm calling him Jean. His name is John. I'm just in a weird fucking mood or something. John says, the way we conceptualize nature is a reflection of capitalist ideologies. And we can actually we can look at alternative ways of understanding human and ecological relationships in order to reimagine our assumptions both about economy and the nature of life. So that's just a lovely little point, that our understandings of nature are culturally constructed. Salvage rhythms is the next chapter. And here's a goofy picture from The Labyrinth. Tsing opens this chapter with a discussion of a forest in Borneo, a village in Borneo. And a logging company came in and logged the forest. And when there was no more trees left, the company left. And when they left a bunch of rusting machinery. Now the people in these villages in this area no longer had a forest in which to be able to feed themselves, and they no longer had jobs from the logging company, and so they turned to selling scrap metal from the project. This is the rhythm of salvage production. Here Tsing is playing with salvage. It means multiple things. Because of course she talks in earlier chapters about salvage accumulation. But here she talks about the ways of salvaging resources within the ruins of capitalism. So we follow salvage rhythms, whether the market for scrap or the entangled histories of foraging for matsutake mushrooms. By rhythms, I mean forms of temporal coordination, and without the singular forward pulse of progress, the unregularized coordination of salvage is what we have. So basically what she's saying is that with the shift away from these progress-oriented narratives that were oriented by the factory, and a shift from factory production, or what sometimes you will call in economics, vertical integration, to the supply chain, what you see is this disruption of this progress narrative, which falls apart, is no longer an organizing principle of social relations or economic relations. And what we're left with is these moments of uncoordinated salvage, these multiple temporalities, these multiple rhythms that we live within, as we salvage what life we can in the ruins of capitalism, and as capitalist corporations salvage what value they can from these spaces as well. Thinking through salvage rhythms changes our vision. Industrial work no longer charts the future. Livelihoods are various, cobbled together, and often temporary. That's precarity. And here, Tsing is starting to transition to the next section of the book. I've tried to show how precarious living in scenes that both use and refuse capitalist governance. Such assemblages tell us what's left, despite capitalist damage. But because collaboration is always with us, we can maneuver within its possibilities. We need a politics of the strength of diverse and shifting coalitions, not just for humans. So if salvage is both a way of making life within ruins, but also a mechanism through which supply chains exploit us, what kinds of collaboration do we need? What kinds of politics do we need for these kinds of conditions? What are our possibilities for maneuvering? In the interlude, Tsing gives us some really actually neat, fun facts about mushroom biology and ecology. I really enjoyed that kind of stuff, thinking about mushrooms as having exterior stomachs. What an interesting way of thinking about the body. Thinking about co-development as an alternative to this model of competition, which is something John Favini talks about in the article that I've linked to. Thinking about this process by which mushrooms connect and share nutrients between trees, providing what some people have called the wood wide web. That's cute. So here's some fun facts about mushroom biology and ecology. But what Tsing does in this chapter, right, is she's tracing that on the one hand, the dominant theories of nature and science reflect capitalist ideologies in many ways. But at the same time, thinking about matsutake, thinking about co-development between species, it helps us understand how does those kinds of frameworks help us understand life in a different way? How does it help us think through the possibilities both of capitalist exploitation and the possibilities of life in the ruins of capitalism? And Agnes Scott concludes, as with capitalist supply chains, these chains of entanglement are not saleable. Whether we're talking, so both between the chains between mushrooms and ecological relationships and capitalist supply chains, these entanglements are not scalable. Their components cannot be reduced to self-replicating interchangeable objects, i.e. the commodity, whether firms or species. Instead, they require attention to the histories of encounter that maintain the chain. Natural history description, rather than mathematical modeling, is the necessary first step. As in the economy, radical curiosity beckons. Perhaps an anthropologist, trained in one of the few remaining sciences that values observation and description, might come in handy. And I think this is a useful quote to leave you all with a question, which is, how is anthropology, what does she mean by this, especially the bolded section? How does anthropology, because of its specific history, give us an alternative, a useful framework for doing research in the context of both supply chains and the ruins of capitalism? How does this emphasis on observation and description in ethnography as an alternative to mathematical modeling? How does that help? What does that mean in terms of anthropology and ethnography? What does that, how do those approaches help us do research and help us survive and make life within spaces of ruin in the afterlife of progress? If you need structure, as always, I've given you all some questions for thinking through the chapter in the discussion boards. Make sure you do post on the discussion board because that is the basis of your participation grade. I'll see you guys on later this week.